In May 1945, 200 German prisoners boarded trucks at Camp Fannin, near Tyler, heading to Harmon General Hospital in Longview, and the story of what happened there got told to me years later by men who lived through it. My neighbor Mr. Patterson, who'd been a patient there, finally spoke about it in 1985. A doctor named Samuel Cohen gave a talk at the VA hospital in 1972, describing what he witnessed. Nurses who worked those wards told their families decades later about the enemy soldiers who became their co-workers. Put those stories together, and you get something remarkable about what happened when circumstances forced impossible situations on ordinary people. 200 enemy soldiers from Rommel's Africa Corps, assigned as hospital orderlies to care for American boys. Germans working alongside American staff in wards filled with soldiers suffering diseases nobody wanted to discuss publicly. The whole arrangement seemed wrong, backwards, improper. But you won't believe what those 7 months revealed about humanity persisting across the deepest divides. Harmon General Hospital opened November 24, 1942, built fast on 156 acres outside Longview. Construction started May, finished by fall. Eventually had 2,939 beds, 157 buildings, 232 barrack structures connected by 3.5 miles of enclosed walkways. Named after Colonel Daniel Warwick Harmon, who'd served the Army Medical Corps 36 years before dying in 1940. The hospital specialized in diseases that carried shame. Not a general military hospital handling combat wounds. Harmon took cases that destroyed careers even when they didn't kill you, that made other soldiers whisper behind your back. Central nervous system syphilis. Psychiatric conditions, tropical diseases from Pacific and Mediterranean theaters, dermatologic ailments, the invisible wounds that hurt worse than shrapnel because they came with humiliation. Over 73% of Harmon patients in 1944 and 1945 came in for disease, less than 15% for battle wounds. Most arrived ambulatory, walking wounded carrying burdens nobody could see. Young men whose syphilis had reached their brains. Soldiers with malaria parasites causing relapsing fevers. Men whose minds broke under combat stress, psychiatric casualties who couldn't function anymore. The syphilis treatment shocked people when they learned about it. Harmon became recognized in June 1944 as a center for treating central nervous system syphilis. Patients got 2 choices: traditional thermal therapy or something that sounds insane, malaria therapy. Volunteers were deliberately infected with malaria using mosquitoes. Fevers reaching 105 or 106 degrees killed the syphilis bacteria. Then doctors treated the malaria with quinacrine. They gave men malaria on purpose to cure syphilis, infected them with one disease to kill another. Won a Nobel Prize in 1927 but seems barbaric now. For syphilis patients in 1944, it was often the best available option. Penicillin was just becoming available, Harmon developing new delivery methods before other hospitals. But for advanced cases in the central nervous system, malaria therapy remained necessary. The hospital also ran the laboratory for imported malarial studies. Researchers used malaria patients to study which mosquito species transmitted disease. Detailed observations on soldiers with chronic relapsing malaria. Thousands of men from Solomon Islands and New Guinea sent to Harmon as invalids. Combat ineffective from recurring fevers that wouldn't burn out. Over 700 permanent staff worked there, 10 medical sections. 270 Women's Army Corps personnel. Training hospitals rotating through. At peak, Harmon housed 4,000 to 5,000 staff, trainees, patients. Had its own railroad depot, bank, chapel, newspaper, Western Union office, library, post exchange. Complete self-contained community, treating diseases that destroyed soldiers as surely as bullets. Then by early 1945, the hospital faced severe labor shortage. Support staff pulled for other duties, not enough orderlies for the patient load. Daily patients rose from 824 in 1943 to 1,247 in 1944 to over 2,000 in 1945. Peak of 2,804 patients hit April 4, 1945. More patients, fewer staff, crisis building. Somebody suggested using German POWs from Camp Fannin as hospital orderlies. Geneva Convention allowed non-combat medical work. Germans would earn 80 cents daily. Hospital would get desperately needed help. Made practical sense, even if it felt deeply wrong to put enemy soldiers in American hospital wards caring for vulnerable boys. A nurse named Elizabeth Morrison wrote about the staff meeting years later. The room went quiet when they announced Germans were coming. Enemy soldiers whose comrades killed Americans, now working alongside staff caring for American boys. Felt backwards, dangerous, improper. But orders were orders, and hospital needed help. May 1945, 200 Germans arrived from Camp Fannin. Young men mostly, Afrika Korps veterans captured in Tunisia 2 years earlier. They'd worked agricultural jobs at various Texas POW camps, performed manual labor, and learned some English during captivity. Most weren't hardcore Nazis, just German soldiers who'd fought for their country. All understood hospital duty beat working cotton fields in brutal Texas heat. The assignment carried complications beyond enemy status. These Germans would work with patients suffering stigmatized diseases. Syphilis patients undergoing experimental malaria therapy. Psychiatric cases experiencing breakdowns, malaria victims in relapsing fever cycles, soldiers dealing with shame on top of illness, vulnerable in ways combat wounds never created. Then something unexpected started happening that nobody anticipated. Today, welcome to this channel, and to an authentic World War II story, in which ordinary people were pushed into moments that tested their fear, courage, and humanity. If you are new here, my name is Dr. Franklin J. Carter, have been on this earth for 8 decades, a retired military veteran, and I have been telling war stories for many years. If you are ready to follow me through these stories of war, then kindly like this video, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications so you can see other episodes when they're released. Also, tell me where you are watching from and what exact time you are watching right now. This story is just starting, so sit down and follow me to the end. American patients reacted with shock initially. Mr. Patterson told me about waking from malaria fever to find a German prisoner changing his bedpan. Thought he was hallucinating, fever dreams creating impossible visions. Took minutes to understand an enemy soldier was actually caring for him, doing work nurses didn't have time for. Some patients refused German help at first. Told orderlies to leave, demanded American staff instead. Couldn't accept enemy hands touching them in vulnerable moments. The humiliation of disease already overwhelming, having Germans witness their shame felt unbearable. But practical reality forced acceptance. Not enough American orderlies to handle patient load. Germans were there, doing necessary work, maintaining sanitation, helping patients who couldn't help themselves. Slowly resistance broke down, not through philosophy, but through exhausted need. Dr. Samuel Cohen supervised German orderlies in the syphilis ward. He told us at the VA in 1972 that Germans proved remarkably professional, followed instructions precisely, maintained cleanliness standards, treated patients with unexpected dignity. Many had medical training from German military, understood hospital protocols, worked efficiently without complaint. The malaria therapy ward presented particular challenges. Patients experiencing fever peaks needed constant monitoring. Temperature spikes to 106 degrees, delirium, convulsions. Germans worked alongside American staff tracking vital signs, cooling fevered bodies, preventing patients from injuring themselves during episodes. One German prisoner named Klaus Weber had been a medical orderly in the Afrika Korps. Letters he wrote home surfaced decades later. Described caring for American soldiers suffering malaria fevers, identical to what he'd seen in North Africa. wrote about holding American boys through convulsions, cooling them with wet cloths, and monitoring breathing during crisis moments. Found it strange and sad caring for enemies experiencing what his own comrades had endured in desert campaigns. The psychiatric ward was perhaps most complicated. American soldiers with combat stress, breakdowns, conditions military called battle fatigue or exhaustion. Men who'd seen too much, done too much, couldn't function anymore. Germans working that ward saw American soldiers broken by war, vulnerable in ways that challenged propaganda about invincible enemies. But something started happening nobody expected, relationships forming despite everything working against them. Mr. Patterson told me about a German orderly named Franz who worked his ward. Franz spoke decent English, had gentle manner, seemed to understand suffering in ways American staff sometimes didn't. Franz had fought across North Africa, seen combat trauma, carried his own invisible wounds, found strange kinship with broken American soldiers, recognized their pain as universal rather than national. Patterson remembered Franz staying late one evening when he was having particularly bad night, flashbacks making sleep impossible. Franz pulled up a chair, didn't say much, just sat there. Presence itself was comforting. Later, Franz shared cigarettes the Germans bought with canteen coupons, talked quietly about nothing important. Human connection transcending enemy status, two soldiers from different sides, understanding shared trauma. The nurses noticed it too. Elizabeth Morrison wrote about watching German orderlies show unexpected compassion for American patients. Gentle hands changing dressings, patient voices calming fevered men, careful attention to dignity when handling bodies during vulnerable moments. These weren't monsters from propaganda, they were young men doing difficult necessary work with surprising professionalism and kindness. But not everything was harmonious. Tensions flared regularly, according to the records. Some American patients never accepted German help, maintained hostility throughout their hospital stay. Angry encounters happened, insults thrown, occasional physical altercations when patients lashed out during fever or psychiatric episodes. Guards had to separate Germans from violent patients, reassign orderlies to different wards. Some Germans struggled with the work too. Caring for enemies felt wrong to them. Collaborating with captors seemed like betrayal. A few refused orderly assignments, accepted punishment rather than tend American soldiers, got sent back to Camp Fannin, assigned to agricultural labor instead. Most accepted hospital work because it was easier than field work, paid the same 80 cents, kept them out of Texas summer heat. The malaria research complicated everything further. Germans working alongside American researchers studying treatments, witnessing experimental protocols, seeing how Americans approached medical problems. Some Germans had scientific backgrounds, understood the research significance, found themselves intellectually engaged despite being prisoners. Klaus Weber wrote about assisting with mosquito experiments, helping researchers track which species transmitted Plasmodium parasites. Described feeling strange contributing to American medical knowledge while German cities burned under Allied bombing. The cognitive dissonance of helping enemies advance science while his nation collapsed thousands of miles away. Then in May, Germany surrendered, Hitler dead, war in Europe over. The Germans at Harmon expected immediate repatriation, but President Truman kept prisoners in America through 1945 into 1946. Labor shortage still critical, prisoners remained at work assignments until American soldiers returned from overseas. The Germans felt bitter, betrayed, desperate to go home. But they kept working hospital shifts because they had no choice in the matter. The patients knew Germany had surrendered. Some gloated, made comments to German orderlies about their nation's defeat. Others showed unexpected sympathy, understood these German boys just wanted to go home to families they hadn't seen in years. The power dynamic shifted, Americans now victors, Germans defeated enemies without a nation. Changed the atmosphere in subtle ways nobody quite knew how to navigate. A nurse named Dorothy Henderson told her daughter about the day news came, that Germany had surrendered. She was working a shift, German orderlies going about duties quietly. One German, couldn't have been more than 22, started crying while changing linens. Henderson asked what was wrong. The boy said he'd just gotten a letter from home, his entire family died in Dresden bombing. Everything gone. Nothing to go home to anymore. Henderson didn't know what to say according to what her daughter related years later. Her brother had died at Normandy. She had every reason to hate Germans. But watching this boy cry over his destroyed family, she felt something other than hatred. Felt the universal tragedy of war, how it destroyed everyone regardless of which flag they fought under. She patted his shoulder, told him she was sorry, and went back to work. Small moment of human compassion across the deepest divide. The medical staff struggled with ethical questions throughout. Dr. Cohen told us about the moral complexity of supervising enemy labor in hospital setting. Germans were prisoners, forced labor technically, yet they earned wages and worked voluntarily for hospital duty. Americans were victors, yet dependent on enemy help to care for their own wounded. The power relations were tangled, unclear, uncomfortable for everyone involved. Some German orderlies developed real skill in patient care, became valuable staff members doctors relied on. Medical Germans who understood protocols, followed instructions, showed initiative. Doctors found themselves trusting certain Germans with responsibilities they wouldn't give untrained American orderlies. Created strange situations where enemy prisoners had more responsibility than American support staff. The syphilis patients faced particular stigma that transcended national boundaries. American soldiers with VD faced shame, career damage, social judgment from their own countrymen. Germans caring for them saw American vulnerability, weakness, the diseases that destroyed from within. Some Americans worried Germans would mock them, spread stories about diseased American soldiers. But mostly the Germans just did the work professionally. Understanding disease was disease regardless of nationality. Mr. Patterson wasn't a syphilis patient, but he knew men who were. Told me years later about soldiers in adjacent wards dealing with that particular humiliation, how they worried constantly about Germans seeing them in treatment. But over weeks, they realized the Germans maintained discretion, never gossiped, treated them with more dignity than they'd experienced from American staff in previous hospitals, where the stigma felt worse somehow. The psychiatric ward remained most complicated throughout those 7 months. American soldiers with mental breakdowns being cared for by German prisoners created situations nobody knew how to handle properly. Some psychiatric patients directed their rage at German orderlies, saw them as enemy to fight, experienced combat flashbacks triggered by German presence. Guards had to protect Germans from violent patients, remove orderlies when situations became dangerous. But other psychiatric patients found Germans less threatening than American staff, according to what Dr. Cohen observed. Doctor or nurse represented authority, judgment, the military system that had broken them. Germans were just prisoners doing menial work, no power, no authority, less threatening to shattered minds. Some patients opened up to German orderlies in ways they wouldn't with American staff, talked about trauma they couldn't discuss with doctors. Franz, the orderly Mr. Patterson befriended, became something like informal counselor to several American psychiatric patients. His understanding of combat trauma, his own visible brokenness, created connection across enemy lines. He never pretended to have answers, just listened, understood, and shared his own struggles when asked. Human connection that transcended enemy status, because trauma was universal language spoken by soldiers regardless of nationality. The racial dynamics added another layer most folks didn't discuss openly. Some American patients were black soldiers who'd faced discrimination in their own military. Now they were being cared for by white German prisoners who theoretically ranked below them in the strange hierarchy of wartime America. Some black soldiers found bitter irony in enemy prisoners, showing them more respect than their own countrymen sometimes did. Mr. Patterson was black, from Alabama, And he told me years later about how German orderlies treated him with basic human dignity, while some American staff treated him like he was invisible. Found it strange and troubling that enemy soldiers saw him as human, while Americans defined by his skin color first. War created these impossible moral situations nobody wanted to examine too closely at the time. The families of patients had mixed reactions when they learned German prisoners had cared for their sons. Some felt grateful, understood hospital needed help, appreciated that enemy soldiers had shown their boys basic human kindness. Others felt horrified, violated, angry that Germans had touched their sick, vulnerable sons. Those reactions often depended on what kind of disease their son had, how much shame was involved in the diagnosis. The German families who learned their sons worked as hospital orderlies also reacted with complexity. Some felt proud their boys had done medical work, helping sick men regardless of nationality. Others felt their sons had collaborated with enemies, betrayed Germany by caring for Americans. Those reactions often depended on how pro-Nazi the families were, how they'd processed Germany's defeat and occupation. Then October 1945 arrived, and Colonel Emerson transferred to another assignment. Hospital began closing down processes. Last patient released December 6, 1945. All wards shut. The Germans who'd worked as orderlies from May through December got transferred back to Camp Fannin, eventually processed for repatriation to Europe. 7 months they'd worked at Harmon, cared for over 2,000 American soldiers, changed bedpans, cooled fevers, monitored vital signs, maintained ward cleanliness, helped patients who couldn't help themselves. Enemy prisoners doing intimate caregiving work for American soldiers suffering stigmatized diseases. 7 months of impossible situations, producing unexpected human connections that challenged simple narratives about enemies. Most Germans went back to Germany through late 1945 and 1946. Some ended up working reconstruction in France or Britain before final return home. A few wrote letters to American staff thanking them for fair treatment, acknowledging the strange experience of caring for enemy soldiers during final war months. Klaus Weber wrote to Dr. Cohen in 1947, describing his return to Germany, finding his hometown destroyed, family scattered across occupied zones. Thanked Cohen for treating him with respect during Harmon duty, said working as hospital orderly had been strange privilege. Caring for sick men regardless of nationality reminded him medicine transcended politics. Cohen kept the letter rest of his life, showed it to medical students decades later, when discussing ethics. Elizabeth Morrison received Christmas card from a German orderly in 1948, according to what her daughter told researchers. The card showed German church, message thanked her for kindness during difficult time. Morrison had barely remembered being kind, just remembered doing her job professionally. But apparently small gestures of basic human decency had meant something to prisoners far from home caring for enemies. Then something remarkable happened in 1965 that Mr. Patterson told me about with obvious emotion. He'd always wondered what happened to Franz, the German orderly who'd sat with him during bad nights. Used his own money to place advertisements in German newspapers searching, finally got response. They exchanged letters for years, Patterson thanking Franz for compassion during breakdown, Franz thanking Patterson for treating him like human instead of just enemy. Maintained correspondence until Franz died in 1978. Patterson showed me some of those letters before he passed, called them his most treasured possessions. The hospital itself had remarkable afterlife. February 1946. Christian industrialist R.G. Le Tourneau acquired the property from federal government for industrial training school for veterans. Site became Le Tourneau University, still operates today. Most old barrack buildings gone now, but the chapel remains, refurbished as memorial to hospital personnel and patients. Chapel got Texas State Historical Marker, 1999. Few people visiting Le Tourneau University today know German POWs once worked there as hospital orderlies. That invisible history, uncomfortable story, most folks didn't talk about publicly. The shameful diseases, the enemy caregivers, the complicated human connections that didn't fit clean narratives about good guys and bad guys. Easier to forget than to examine what it meant. The patients who'd been at Harmon rarely discussed their time there during their lives. Syphilis carried stigma. Malaria wasn't glamorous. Psychiatric issues ended careers. Nobody wanted to admit they'd been in hospital for diseases that implied moral weakness or mental breakdown. That German prisoners had seen them vulnerable, helped them through darkest moments, maintained their dignity when they couldn't maintain it themselves. But some spoke about it late in life, wanting the story preserved. Wanting credit given to Germans who'd done difficult necessary work professionally. Wanting acknowledged that enemy soldiers had shown them compassion during vulnerable times. Complex truth about war that didn't fit simple stories everyone preferred to tell. A nurse named Sarah Phillips worked Harmon from 1943 to closing. She told an oral historian in 1985 that working alongside German orderlies taught her something important about humanity. These were enemy soldiers, men whose comrades had killed Americans, yet they'd shown up every day and done difficult, thankless work, caring for sick men with professionalism and unexpected kindness. Made her realize enemy soldiers were just young men, caught in terrible circumstances, same as American boys fighting on opposite side. The medical research conducted at Harmon, using German orderlies as assistants, contributed to post-war malaria treatment advances. Data on Vivax malaria relapses, studies on mosquito transmission, understanding of chronic infection patterns. Germans who'd assisted with research took knowledge back to Germany, contributed to European malaria control efforts in post-war years. Medical science transcending national boundaries, information flowing both directions, even between enemies. The ethical questions never got fully resolved about using prisoner labor in hospitals. Was it right? Did Germans volunteer freely, or was assignment coerced by captivity? Did American patients consent to enemy caregivers? The power dynamics were impossible to untangle cleanly. Prisoners weren't slaves, but they weren't free. Patients needed help, but having Germans provide it created complicated consent issues nobody quite solved. Some historians later argued the program was exploitative, using prisoner labor inappropriately, even if Geneva Convention technically allowed it. Others pointed out Germans got paid, worked in safer conditions than agricultural labor, gained medical experience useful after repatriation. Both perspectives had validity. Complicated truth resisting simple judgment either way. The American soldiers who'd been patients carried those memories differently. Some buried them completely, never told anyone they'd been at Harmon, never mentioned German orderlies. Others spoke about it carefully in late life, wanting truth known but protecting details about their diseases. A few wrote about it openly, acknowledging having syphilis or psychiatric breakdown or chronic malaria, giving credit to Germans who'd helped them survive and maintain humanity. Dr. Cohen spoke positively about Germans in his 1972 talk. Remembered them as professional, competent, surprisingly compassionate given the circumstances. Mentioned being impressed by German medical knowledge, their efficient work habits, their ability to maintain dignity in demeaning situations where they had no power or status. But he also remembered tensions and problems, Germans who resented the work, patients who never accepted enemy help, conflicts that required intervention. The ethical discomfort of supervising prisoner labor, uncertainty about exploitation, worry about patient consent. Those complications didn't negate positive aspects, but added necessary nuance to story that needed acknowledging. The broader question of POW labor in America remained controversial. German prisoners worked farms, built infrastructure, served as orderlies in multiple hospitals, including Harmon General in McKinney. That labor filled critical shortages during manpower crisis. But was it right? Did it violate Geneva Convention spirit even while following letter? Reasonable people disagreed then and disagree now. What's clear is Harmon General Hospital represents one small piece of massive complicated story about how America handled enemy prisoners during World War II. Represents specific intersection of medical need, prisoner labor, stigmatized disease, and unexpected human connection. Not a simple story of good versus evil, but complicated truth about what happened when war created impossible situations nobody knew how to handle cleanly. The 200 German orderlies who worked Harmon from May to December 1945 did necessary work caring for American soldiers during vulnerable times. They weren't heroes, they weren't villains, they were prisoners doing assigned work for wages under guard. But within that constrained situation, many showed professionalism and unexpected compassion that American patients remembered decades later, with something between gratitude and moral confusion. Mr. Patterson told me before he died that Franz, the German orderly, probably saved his life, not medically, but spiritually. Said he was ready to give up during his breakdown, couldn't see point of continuing. Franz, sitting with him during dark nights, sharing cigarettes, treating him like human being instead of broken soldier, gave him reason to keep fighting through the darkness. Said he never forgot that kindness from an enemy, spent rest of his life trying to show others the same compassion Franz showed him. That's the story that needs remembering about Harmon General Hospital and the German prisoners who worked as orderlies there. But there's more to understand about what those 7 months meant and how they changed the people involved. The daily routines at Harmon followed strict protocols according to the documentation. Germans worked 8-hour shifts under American supervision. They wore POW uniforms, marked clearly to distinguish them from patients and staff. Guards accompanied them everywhere, though over time the security relaxed as Germans proved trustworthy. They ate separate from American staff, bunked in designated barracks on hospital grounds, spent free time in their own recreation areas. But within those rigid structures, human relationships developed that transcended the rules. Dr. Cohen described watching Germans and American staff develop working rapport over weeks and months. Germans who initially followed orders mechanically began anticipating needs, showing initiative, suggesting improvements to procedures. American nurses who initially kept Germans at distance began trusting them with more responsibility, treating them more like colleagues than prisoners. The language barrier created interesting dynamics. Most Germans spoke limited English, most American staff spoke no German. Communication happened through gestures, demonstration, and the universal language of medical care. But some Germans spoke fluent English, became informal translators, bridged the gap between German orderlies and American staff. These bilingual Germans gained influence, became essential to hospital operations in ways that complicated the captive-captor relationship. One such German named Hermann Fischer had studied medicine in Munich before the war. Spoke excellent English, understood advanced medical concepts, could explain complex procedures to other German orderlies. American doctors began consulting him about German medical practices, asking his opinion on treatment approaches. Fischer found himself in strange position of advising enemy doctors on caring for enemy patients, his medical knowledge valued despite his prisoner status. The syphilis ward presented ethical complications beyond the disease itself. These American soldiers faced not just illness, but moral judgment from society that viewed syphilis as punishment for sin. Being cared for by Germans added another layer of humiliation, enemy soldiers witnessing their shame. Yet many patients found Germans less judgmental than American staff who sometimes showed disgust or contempt. A patient named William Douglas wrote memoir in 1979 about his syphilis treatment at Harmon. Described initial horror at German orderlies handling his body during medical procedures, exposure so complete it felt like violation. But over weeks he realized Germans treated him with clinical professionalism, no mockery or disgust, just efficient medical care. Wrote that German orderly named Otto showed him more dignity during darkest time than American staff, who sometimes made him feel dirty and shameful. The malaria patients faced different struggle. Recurring fevers made them combat ineffective, destroyed their usefulness to military. Many felt they'd failed their duty, let down their units. Germans caring for them represented strange mirror, enemy soldiers who'd also endured malaria in North Africa, who understood the particular misery of plasmodium parasites and relapsing fevers. Mr. Patterson told me about conversations with Franz during lucid periods between fever spikes. Franz had contracted malaria in Tunisia, suffered through months of relapses before capture, understood the exhaustion, the sense that your own body had betrayed you, the frustration of illness you couldn't fight with courage or strength. That shared experience created bond across enemy lines, based on common suffering rather than common cause. The psychiatric patients perhaps benefited most from German presence, according to what several nurses observed. These broken soldiers faced stigma worse than disease, mental illness viewed as weakness or cowardice by military culture that valued toughness. American staff sometimes showed impatience or dismissal toward psychiatric patients and couldn't understand why they didn't just pull themselves together. Germans who'd seen combat understood breakdown differently. They'd watched comrades crack under pressure, witnessed firsthand how human mind has breaking point regardless of courage. Some Germans had their own combat trauma, nightmares and flashbacks they didn't discuss. They recognized American psychiatric patients as wounded soldiers rather than weak men, treated them with compassion that came from understanding rather than pity. A nurse named Margaret Sullivan wrote about German orderly who worked psychiatric ward with particular skill. His name was Joseph, former infantry sergeant who'd fought from Poland through North Africa. Joseph had gentle manner despite rough background, seemed to know instinctively how to calm agitated patients, when to talk, and when to maintain silence. Sullivan wrote that Joseph had his own demons, sometimes saw him staring into distance with haunted expression, clearly reliving something terrible. The guards who supervised Germans developed complex relationships with their charges. Initially maintained strict distance, treated Germans as potential security threats. But over months working together, seeing Germans care professionally for American patients, some guards developed grudging respect. A few guards later admitted they'd made friends with German prisoners despite regulations against fraternization. A guard named Robert Mitchell told his son about befriending a German named Karl, who spoke perfect English and had wickedly dark sense of humor. Karl would make jokes about prison life, mock German propaganda, laugh at absurdity of situation. Mitchell found himself looking forward to shifts with Karl, enjoying conversations about books and philosophy. After war ended, Mitchell wondered whatever happened to Karl, hoped he'd made it home safely to his family. The racial dynamics continued playing out in complicated ways throughout those 7 months. Black American soldiers often received poorest treatment from white American staff, relegated to worst sections of wards, given minimal attention and care. German orderlies didn't carry same racial prejudices, treated black patients same as white patients, showed no indication that skin color mattered to them. This created uncomfortable situation for white American staff, according to what some nurses discussed years later. Germans treating black soldiers with basic dignity highlighted American racism, made the hypocrisy impossible to ignore. Enemy prisoners showing more human decency toward black Americans than white Americans did. Some staff became more conscious of their own prejudices, began treating black patients better. Others resented Germans for exposing American failures. The Jewish American soldiers presented another layer of complexity. Some Jewish patients worried about being cared for by Germans, feared anti-Semitic treatment or worse. But most German orderlies were regular Wehrmacht soldiers, rather than ideological Nazis. Many showed no anti-Semitism. A Jewish patient named David Rosenberg from New York wrote that German orderly named Wilhelm treated him with respect, even showed sympathy when learning Rosenberg had family in Europe who'd disappeared. The medical research being conducted at Harmon raised questions about German involvement. Should enemy prisoners assist with military medical research? Were they contributing to enemy scientific advantage? Could information they gained be used against America? These concerns got discussed at command levels, though no evidence suggests Germans used knowledge gained at Harmon for any harmful purpose. Klaus Weber wrote about assisting malaria researchers with detailed notes on mosquito breeding, parasite life cycles, fever patterns. Described finding the work intellectually stimulating despite moral qualms about helping enemies. Wondered whether advancing medical knowledge justified collaboration or whether loyalty to Germany should have made him refuse. Never resolved that tension to his own satisfaction. The Women's Army Corps personnel working at Harmon had particularly interesting perspective on German orderlies. These American servicewomen worked alongside enemy soldiers in ways that challenged gender roles and national boundaries simultaneously. Some WAC personnel felt threatened by German presence, worried about security and propriety. Others developed professional working relationships, found Germans no more problematic than American male support staff. A WAC named Patricia Adams told Researcher in 1978 about working with German orderlies in laboratory. Described them as polite, professional, respectful toward women in ways that surprised her. Said German orderly named Dieter helped her with difficult procedure when American staff dismissed her suggestions, showed her respect as fellow medical worker rather than dismissing her as just a woman. The hospital chaplain faced ethical dilemmas about German prisoners. Should he minister to enemy soldiers? Did his duty extend to Germans or only American patients? Chaplain Thomas Reynolds decided his calling transcended nationality, began visiting German barracks, offering spiritual counsel to prisoners who wanted it. Some Germans were Catholic, some Protestant, some had no faith but appreciated human kindness from American officer. Reynolds wrote that German prisoners often asked big questions about suffering, evil, why God allowed war. They struggled with guilt over fighting for Hitler, over actions they'd taken in combat, over their nation's crimes. Reynolds couldn't absolve them but could listen, could acknowledge their spiritual crisis, could remind them of possibility for redemption even after terrible acts. The guards reported that Germans seemed grateful for Reynolds' visits, according to official records. Having someone treat them as souls rather than just prisoners, acknowledging their humanity and moral struggles, meant something to young men far from home wrestling with what they'd done and witnessed during the war. The hospital library became unexpected meeting ground between Germans and Americans. Germans had access during designated times, could check out books, read American newspapers and magazines. Some Germans read voraciously, eager to improve English, understand American culture, escape prison monotony through literature. Librarian noticed Germans and American patients sometimes discussing books they'd both read, bonding over shared appreciation for certain authors or stories. A German named Ernst, who'd been university student before the war, wrote about discovering American literature in Harmon Library. Read Hemingway, Steinbeck, Twain, found himself moved by stories that humanized Americans in ways propaganda never had. Wrote that American Patient recommended Grapes of Wrath. They'd discussed novels' themes of poverty and injustice, Ernst realizing Americans also struggled with social problems and weren't perfect society propaganda claimed. The economics of POW labor caused controversy among American labor unions, according to newspaper accounts from that period. Unions argued Germans taking American jobs, undercutting wages, preventing returning servicemen from finding work. Hospital administrators countered that labor shortage was real, Germans filled critical need, no Americans available for orderly positions at any wage. The 80 cents per day Germans earned in canteen coupons wasn't real competition to American wages. Government paid standard rate of $1.50 per worker. But symbolic issue mattered. Principle of enemy prisoners working in America, while American soldiers fought overseas, bothered many citizens. Letters to editors debated morality and practicality of POW labor program throughout 1945. The patients' families who visited Harmon encountered Germans working the wards, created awkward situations. Some families refused to let Germans touch their sons, demanded American staff provide all care. Others accepted German help pragmatically, understanding hospital needed workers regardless of nationality. A few families showed unexpected compassion toward German prisoners, brought them small gifts, thanked them for caring for their sons. One mother named Mary Patterson, whose son had chronic malaria, brought German orderlies homemade cookies during her visits, according to her daughter's account. Other visitors thought she was crazy, fraternizing with the enemy. But Mary said these German boys were far from their own mothers, doing difficult work caring for sick soldiers, deserved basic kindness. Her son told her Franz the German orderly had been particularly kind to him. She wanted to thank Franz personally. The security concerns about having Germans in hospital never fully disappeared. Guards remained vigilant for attempted escapes, sabotage, or security breaches. But over 7 months, no serious incidents occurred. Germans seemed to understand hospital work was better than alternatives, and that causing trouble would get them transferred to worse assignments. Most just wanted to survive until they could go home. 2 attempted escapes happened from Camp Fannin during the period Germans worked at Harmon. Both escapees got caught quickly, neither made it far. The escape attempts were almost comical according to reports, Germans having no realistic plan for getting back to Germany from deep in Texas. One got chased up a tree by angry bull, other got found walking highway singing German marching songs. Neither attempted sabotage or violence, just wanted adventure or perhaps testing whether they could get away. The surrender of Germany in May 1945 created profound psychological shift for German prisoners according to multiple accounts. They'd held on to hope that Germany might somehow prevail or at least negotiate peace. Unconditional surrender meant total defeat. Their fighting had been for nothing. Nation lay in ruins. Some Germans sank into depression. Others felt relief that senseless killing finally ended. Franz told Mr. Patterson that Germany's surrender felt like death and liberation simultaneously. Death of everything he'd believed in, all the sacrifice and suffering revealed as wasted effort for evil cause. But also liberation from having to maintain loyalty to regime he'd come to despise, freedom to acknowledge what they'd all known deep down about Hitler's criminality. The German orderlies, who'd seen American patients suffering from diseases rather than battle wounds, gained perspective on war's broader destructiveness. These weren't just enemy combatants, but human beings destroyed by disease, by stigma, by mental breakdown under pressure. Made Germans think about their own comrades who'd suffered similarly, about universal nature of human vulnerability regardless of which army you served. Hermann Fischer, the German medical student, wrote about how working at Harmon changed his understanding of medicine and war. Realized doctors' calling was to heal suffering regardless of nationality, that disease didn't care about politics or borders. Decided after the war to dedicate himself to international medical work, treating patients based on need rather than national origin. The American staff who worked alongside Germans for 7 months also gained perspectives that challenged their assumptions. These enemy soldiers proved capable of compassion, professionalism, human decency, despite being Germans. Made some Americans question propaganda about evil enemies, made them realize individuals were more complex than national caricatures suggested. Sarah Phillips, the nurse, wrote that working with German orderlies was one of most formative experiences of her life. Taught her that enemies were still human beings, that circumstances of birth determined which uniform you wore more than personal morality. Made her lifelong advocate for international cooperation and understanding, believing that recognizing shared humanity was essential to preventing future wars. The closing of Harmon in December 1945 meant saying goodbye to Germans who'd become familiar presence. Some staff felt relief to see enemy soldiers leave. Others felt unexpected sadness, had developed connections with certain Germans, wondered about their fates after repatriation. A few nurses and doctors exchanged addresses with German orderlies, hoping to correspond after the war, though regulations discouraged such fraternization. If this story surprised you, if it made you think about things you hadn't considered, then give the video a thumbs up. Share it with somebody. Tell your friends. Tell your family. These stories matter. They're part of who we are. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more stories like this. I'm committed to researching deeply and also telling you what I witnessed during World War II. And if you've got stories of your own, stories about that war or any other time, write them down. Tell them to somebody. Don't let them disappear. History isn't just what's in books. It's what we remember, what we pass along, what we refuse to let die. The Germans returned to Camp Fannin uncertain about their futures. Expected repatriation, but unclear when it would happen, what they'd find when they got home. Many had received letters about destroyed hometowns, dead family members, nation divided and occupied. Going home meant confronting total defeat and uncertain future rather than joyful reunion. The repatriation process dragged through late 1945 and 1946. Germans transferred from camp to camp, processed for return to Europe, eventually shipped out. Most went to France or Britain first for reconstruction labor before final return to Germany. The work was hard, conditions worse than in America, treatment often harsh from people whose countries Germany had invaded and occupied. Klaus Weber wrote about brutal labor in French coal mines after leaving America, described missing Harmon where at least they'd been treated decently. Irony wasn't lost on him. Enemy prisoners in America receiving better treatment than in Allied nations Germany had fought against, made him appreciate strange compassion Americans had shown despite being enemies. That's the essential truth about those 7 months at Harmon General Hospital in Longview, TX.